The key implication is that consciousness is not the master of the house. The ego is a little boat floating on top of a raging ocean of psychic activity that it cannot control. You can put the rudder pointing in a certain direction. You can even row, and that gets you somewhere. But that's a small causal force in an ocean of things that are not under the control of ego consciousness.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. I do hope you're enjoying all of the show so far. If you are, please help me get this in front of like-minded souls by sharing it with your friends, leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes, or subscribing with the bell if you're on YouTube. So that way you'll know when all of the new episodes come out. And of course, hit the podcast up on Instagram and Facebook so you can join the fascinating conversation that we've got going on there around the topics we're discussing on the show. Now, today, we have the fascinating topic of the metaphysics implied by Carl Jung's theories to discuss. Now, Jung is one of the great heroes of this podcast, as you probably worked out. And we covered the collective unconscious and synchronicity in the first series for any listeners who are curious about those two important topics and want to go back to it. And we're also covering the topic of the shadow shortly as well. So look out for that one. But to understand the metaphysical implications of his theories, we really need a special guest. A guest who spent his life studying Jung, but fortunately for us, also has a PhD in the philosophy of mind and another PhD in computer science. His scientific reevaluation of the philosophical position of idealism, as he calls it, the mind at large, is really gaining a lot of traction, both with academics and with the public. I think perhaps this extra credibility comes from the fact that he's a rationalist at heart and is extremely knowledgeable about the sciences, particularly quantum physics, having worked at CERN on the Large Hadron Collider. He is, of course, the philosopher and author Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is the executive director of the Essentia Foundation, and his work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. And as a scientist, Bernardo worked for the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, which of course is CERN. And he's written many, many academic papers and books. Do go to his website, bernardokastrup.com, to see the full list of books and papers and articles. He's appeared on many, many media outlets, and he regularly writes for the Scientific American as well as for other platforms as well. Now, today we're mostly going to be speaking about one of his most recent books, Decoding Jung's Metaphysics, the Archetypal Semantics of an Experiential Universe. But we do take time first to talk about his scientific and philosophical worldview as it relates directly to Jung. So do feel free to jump ahead using the timestamps in the show notes if you want to get directly into the Jung bit, if you know Bernardo's philosophical work already. Now, you listeners have been crying out for me to get Bernardo on, so I'm extremely grateful that he's made himself available for us. I've been wanting to speak to him ever since I first came up with the idea for the podcast, so I can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Bernardo Kastrup, on popular demand, thank you so much for coming on Chasing Consciousness. How are you?
I'm doing great. And yourself? Thanks for having me, by the way.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. I'm really, really well and really excited about this episode about one of my heroes, Carl Jung, from such a specialist. But Bernardo, we love to get started on the show talking with my guests about their earliest conscious memories. Is there anything you remember from that time, usually somewhere between sort of 8 and 12 years old, when you first started to have those meta-conscious reflections?
Oh, I have memories from before I was 1 year old. Plenty of those too. There was a period in my life, I think I was 9 or 10 years old, period of about 6 months, in which I had this sudden spontaneous and repeated experience of suddenly realizing that apparently I am not the world around me. And even more strangely, I never was the world around me, apparently. I am not the other people I see. I am not the trees. I'm not the cars, the buildings. And that struck me for a period of 6 months as something mightily unnatural and weird. So much so, I had a physical reaction to it. I literally had a cold shiver run down my spine, from the back of my neck all the way down my spine. I could feel it, together with a sensation of goosebumps. And every time I had this thought, I would have this physical reaction and think, how incredibly weird that I am me and I'm not the rest. Oh, and it's apparently true, right? I was sure it was true. That's the narrative of our culture. Today, I can look back and interpret it in a different way, but back then, it was a major cognitive dissonance.
Interesting that it was painful, that it seemed uncomfortable.
It was curious at the same time. Sometimes I would remember the thought and then evoke the thought in order to have that experience, because there was a part of me who thought that, that this is so weird. It's cool. You know, when you're young, you're a kid. You know, every new experience is sort of a great discovery, a great adventure.
Absolutely, and we're certainly going to be getting into the importance of that very idea. Now, Bernardo, before we get on to your recent book on Jung's metaphysics, I'd like to take a moment to understand, and also for the audience, some of the audience may not know your work, to try and get your scientific and philosophical position in a wider sense, because I think it really helps us find the window through which you're interpreting Jung. And for ideas as fertile and perhaps ahead of their time as Jung's, we, the public, we really need the right scientific perspective to make the most of his ideas, because I think they've got a lot of potential to really help us in society. For those listeners of you desperate to get into the Jung part, they can hop forward using the timestamps in the show notes, but I really recommend you listen to this bit about Bernardo's unique type of analytical idealism, as it really offers an important perspective for thinking about Jung. Although I think Jung himself probably would have been shy to tag himself philosophically, because above all, he just wanted the psyche and psychiatry to be dealt with in a scientific way. And that included the psyche's subjective nature, particularly when interrelating with the collective unconsciousness. So we're going to be getting into that and how to approach these ideas tentatively, scientifically, as Bernardo is really uniquely qualified to do. So stand by, Jung lovers. It's all about to kick off here. So Bernardo, the main spearhead of your current work at the Essentia Foundation is a scientific reevaluation of the famous philosophical position of idealism. And the listeners can hear in our backlog of shows many important neuroscientists who represent materialism, which we'll be coming back to shortly. They can hear David Chalmers on dualism. They can hear Philip Goff on panpsychism. So perhaps, Bernardo, you can do us the honors of introducing their alternative, idealism. And maybe you can start with the historical context, which we often forget was so different from our own post-scientific revolution context. And maybe a good place to start is with those early scientists needing to separate the implications of their work from the church's sort of ferociously protected domain of the soul and metaphysics. And then this sort of sidestep from the scientists leading to the isolation of the quantitative sciences from philosophy, and this sort of entrenching of materialism as a standalone worldview, rather than just a methodology as it started out.
In the early days of science, to do science risked your life. Bruno was burned at the stake because the clergy had control over the levers of society, including law and order. So it was, socio-politically speaking, almost necessary for science to sort of carve out a metaphysical space for its activities in such a way that the church wouldn't feel threatened. And the most straightforward way to do that, even though describing the way I'm about to describe it, it will sound absurd, but it sounded like a lifesaver at the time. Everything was psyche. Everything was mental, mind stuff. as far as the church was concerned, because the word psyche is a translation of a Greek word, psyche, which translates both into mind and spirit and soul. So early scientists needed to carve out a space for their work that wasn't psyche. But what is then left? Because all we have is experience. Everything is psyche, everything is qualitative, the colors we see, the tastes we feel, the entire world is psychical in that sense, in the sense that it's constituted of experiences. Well, the way they found to do that was to say, okay, these numbers that we use to describe the world, like when I say my piece of luggage weighs 50 kilograms, that 50 is a number. Or we can say the distance between this town and the next is 10 kilometers. Now that 10 is a number, and these are things that describe the world. These numbers are descriptions. But to carve out a separate metaphysical space, early scientists thought, okay, let's take these numbers and instead of regarding them as descriptions, let's regard them as something that precedes the thing described. Let's take these numbers and consider them primary. In other words, before there is a piece of luggage, there is the 50 kilograms. The 50 kilograms is not a description of the piece of luggage. It is the very being of the piece of luggage. And the qualities, the thing we see, those are secondary. Those arise in our brain. They're made by our brain somehow. We don't know how, but let's say that that's how it happens. And that's how materialism came about. Something that was probably politically inspired, even for very good reasons. People didn't want to die, and that's a good reason enough. And in the early days of the Enlightenment, we knew that. Denis Diderot, who is one of the two authors of La Encyclopédie, the founding document of the Enlightenment, he's on record saying materialism doesn't work, but we have to use it as a weapon against the church. He's on record saying that. But at around the second half of the 19th century, we forgot that what was once a socio-political fiction, for very good reasons, became something people really started believing in. And there were psychological payoffs for that. If you think mind is a byproduct of the activity of living brains, then the fear of what you will experience after death is gone, because there will be nobody there to experience. The greatest fear of mankind was eliminated all of a sudden. We take it for granted today, but it was a great liberation in the late 19th century when we declared God to be dead, as Nietzsche put it. And we are still living in the effects of that. So materialism is not based, and was not originally based on reason and evidence. It was based on psychological and socio-political motivations. And it still is the case today, we just forgot.
And the idealism that existed before that, how did it change in the face of that sort of scientific revolution?
Well, idealism was mainstream in the West all the way into the first half of the 19th century, because that was a time when people still remembered that materialism was a kind of a game, a kind of fiction that was taken half seriously. So Hegelian idealism was dominant in Western civilization in the first half of the 19th century. It was the basis even of theology. Many Reformed churches in Europe, like the Reformed Church of Denmark, were Hegelian churches. Academia was completely dominated by Hegelian idealism, the notion of the absolute mind as the bottom level of reality. That began to change in the second half of the 19th century, and then it changed very quickly. It was a phenomenal tipping point in the history of our culture. And by the early 20th century, we proceeded to completely eliminate it with logical positivism and then behaviorism. We eliminated it to the point of not only saying that mind is not the foundation of reality, there isn't even such a thing to speak of. Mind isn't even there. That's behaviorism for you, 1960s, not that long ago.
But an important concept that you use that really helps the Western, materialism-rooted mind grasp your perspective is what you call the dissociative boundary. Now, tell us how this helps us to shift from our sort of materialist, our body's identity separate from the rest of the world perspective, to the perspective that physical reality is a representation of a much deeper unified reality. It's an idea that really reminds me of Don Hoffman's user interface analogy. If listeners want to go back and hear a similar insight from Don Hoffman. Bernardo, what is this dissociative boundary, and what's its relevance to this shift in our perspective?
All the philosophical problems we have in metaphysics arise from trying to come up with distinct ontological grounds for reality. Like there is matter and there is mind. Under dualism, the difficulty is, well, how do they interact with one another if they are fundamentally different? Under physicalism or materialism, the problem is to say, okay, how does mind arise from matter? They are incommensurable. There is nothing about physical arrangements in terms of which I could deduce the qualities of experience, like the redness of red, or how it feels to have a bellyache or to fall in love. So every time you have these two ontic categories that are different, mind and matter, you have a problem. The way to avoid that problem is to say, well, there isn't two things. There aren't two things. There is only mind. And why mind and not matter? Well, because mind is the empirical given. It's the pre-theoretical given of nature. All theories are created in mind. Before you start theorizing, all there is mind. Everything else is a theoretical abstraction. So you say, okay, we start from mind. We avoid that problem. To avoid other problems, we have to say there is only one mind. Because otherwise, why would multiple fundamentally independent minds pop out fundamentally out of nothing in nature at the same time? And how do they interact if they are fundamentally different? So you don't want that either. So what you end up with to avoid our problems is to say there is only one mind in nature, a subjective, well, a field of subjectivity that underlies all nature. But then why can't I read your thoughts? If it's all one mind, I should be able to read everybody's thoughts. I should be able to know what's happening in China right now, what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, but I don't know. I don't know even what's going on behind me. To account for this seeming dissociation, this seeming fragmentation of one mind, I leverage the empirically given notion of dissociation, which for 2 decades now is no longer something that is in doubt in psychiatry. We know it exists. Since the advent of neuroimaging, we know it exists. And it does exactly this. It creates a seeming fragmentation in one mind, leading to the seeming appearance of distinct centers of awareness that cannot reach each other's cognitive contents directly.
You give a good example, but don't you, Bernardo, of MRI imaging of schizophrenic patients, split personality patients that have completely different MRI scans? I mean, as if they're literally from different brains.
I wouldn't go as far as highlighting the differences, but this study done in the Netherlands in 2014 by Jolanda Schlumpf and her team shows that it is possible for psychiatrists to diagnose dissociative identity disorder based on patterns of brain activity alone, without a clinical interview. In other words, to make a completely objective diagnosis of dissociation, because it turns out that dissociative patterns of mentation look like something very identifiable. And that's not something you can fake. A more extraordinary study was done 1 year later in Germany in 2015, in which there was this woman who had multiple dissociated personalities or alters, 2 of which claimed to be blind, even though the woman could see. If that had happened in the 19th century, you would have said, well, the woman is lying. How can we know that she's not lying? Well, in the 21st century, we can. The neuroscientists instrumented her with an EEG cap to measure her brain activity. And when a blind alter was in executive control, there was no brain activity in the visual cortex. And when the host personality was in control, then normal brain activity would return to the visual cortex. So dissociation is literally blinding. It can make you literally blind to what is right in front of your open and well-functioning eyes. So that it prevents me from reading your thoughts seems conservative, given this. It can make you blind to what is in front of you, let alone other people's thoughts or what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda.
But you're using it more here to think of what the dissociated mind sees as a sort of user interface, a dissociated reality that doesn't actually reflect the mind as a whole, the underlying deeper reality that in fact is out there.
If there is only one non-dissociated mind, all experiences are endogenous of the kinds of thoughts, emotions, fantasies, intuitions, things that arise within us without needing perception. They arise even if your eyes are closed and your ears are plugged. But that's not the only type of experience we have. We seem to see and perceive an external world that looks like this physicality around us. For there to be something external, there has to be a boundary that divides the internal from the external. I submit to you that that boundary is dissociation. It's a dissociative boundary. Now, if you are a dissociative process in the context of a broader mind, now there is an outside from your point of view. Whatever is within the dissociative boundary is you. Whatever is outside, it's not you. And you need to interact with the outside, because I submit that biology or life is what dissociation looks like. And life needs to survive. Dissociation needs to survive. And to survive, you need to gather information about your context, the environment around you. So I think we evolved to represent external reality as it impinges on our dissociative boundary as what we call the physical world, the things we see, hear, touch, smell, and sense around us. So physicality or perception, which are synonyms in my view, they arise from dissociation, because that's the way evolution through natural selection has found to represent the mental contents outside the dissociative boundary to the agent inside the dissociative boundary. So every time we talk about a reality outside, or a headset, or the interaction across conscious agents, or perception of a world which we inhabit, all of this presupposes a boundary between what's inside and what's outside. So all of this arises as a function of dissociation, because it's dissociation that creates the boundary.
I think it's a very, very useful way of looking at it, and it definitely helped me get into your ideas. Now, quickly, Bernardo, before we get on to Jung, because it just comes up so much on the show, the classic objection to idealism, dualism, panpsychism from the neuroscientists and other materialists are these clear neural correlates in the brain for various conscious states of mind, most clearly seen in the switching off of consciousness with the introduction of anesthetics into the nervous system. Now, for those materialists, these correlations guarantee that neural activity is basically the same thing as consciousness, in the sense that the physical neural firing causes the mental experience. Now, the neuroscientists...
No, not in the latter sense. Yeah, go ahead.
The neuroscientists I've had on the show, and I've had some absolutely brilliant minds on the show, do go back and hear those shows. They literally laugh when I consider other possibilities, that consciousness might be fundamental, or when I mention David Chalmers and the hard problem. So, Bernardo, despite agreeing with reductionism in some sense, you hold that the neural correlate approach is not the most parsimonious explanation for consciousness, because again, we intuitively make a wrong assumption. Tell us how.
We are dualists. Without even knowing, without even noticing that we are. The correlations between patterns of brain activity and inner experience are obvious and undeniable. And it's not only anesthesia. You drink a glass of beer, something changes in your inner life. That seemingly material glass of beer changes something in your inner life. Or something even more concrete. You stick a needle in your arm, and that physical action has a mental effect. You feel pain and you recoil, you pull your arm away. So the way to understand this under idealism is to understand that we have to take dualism out of the equation. There is no physical needle that is not mental. There is no glass of beer that is not mental. The glass of beer is what a certain transpersonal mental process looks like. And when you ingest the beer, that's the representation in your perception of the process of bringing in an external mental process to the inside of the dissociative boundary. And that one mental process has a causal effect on another is trivial. Your thoughts have causal effects on your emotions. And the other way around, your emotions have causal effects on your thoughts. That glass of beer is what a mental process looks like. And when you bring it in, it as a mental process has a causal effect on the other mental processes in your mind, and you feel drunk. That needle is not a material thing. That needle is what a certain mental process outside your outer looks like when represented cognitively on the screen of perception. That needle being stuck in your arm is what an interaction between two mental processes looks like. And that's why you feel pain, because there is a causal effect from one mental process to another. So when we say, well, if the needle causes pain, obviously then the physical causes the mental, that you're bringing in dualism under the rug. You're not interpreting idealism the way it's meant to be interpreted. You may disagree with it, but for you to be able to evaluate it correctly, you have to evaluate it under its own terms and not by bringing in something under the carpet. Now, anesthesia and unconsciousness, we know now that unresponsive states are not unconscious states. We mistake unresponsiveness for unconsciousness. Pilots undergoing G-force loss of consciousness, when they come round, they report memorable dreams. And this is a quote, memorable dreams. That's a study from 1990. So they were not unconscious when they were passed out. They were having conscious experiences. They just were not responsive. Syncope can lead to psychedelic life experiences. That's why teenagers worldwide, they play this dangerous choking game of partial strangulation that when you pass out and become unresponsive, you're actually tripping without drugs. People describe amazing stuff. We know that during anesthesia, there is such thing as subliminal perception. You don't feel pain, otherwise doctors would see that in your heart rate and and blood pressure. But who is to say that you are not experiencing something during the period of unresponsiveness of general anesthesia? One of the drugs in the anesthesia cocktail is a drug that blocks memory pathway formation. So that you don't remember anything doesn't mean that you were unconscious. It only means that you don't remember whatever it was that you were experiencing. We know it was not pain, but who knows what you were experiencing. This is easy to see. Sometimes you wake up in the morning, by the time you open your eyes, you remember your dream. By the time you sit to put on your slippers, you remember that you dreamed, but you no longer remember the dream. By the time your toothbrush is in your mouth, you no longer remember that you dreamed at all. So at that point, you might say, I was unconscious all night. And then later that day, something may happen that triggers an association. You go like, oh my God, I had this dream last night. So you weren't unconscious. Research now shows that even when you are not dreaming, but you are asleep, there are at least 3 other kinds of sleep experience that are not related to dreaming. How do people know that? Well, they ask volunteers to sleep, instrumented by an EEG cap, and they can read the brain activity of the person and recognize when that's a dream. So what they did is, as soon as the brain activity correlated with the dream stops, they give it several seconds and they know now he's not dreaming. They wake the subject up and immediately ask, were you thinking of something? Were you experiencing something? And people almost invariably say, yeah, I was having that thought, or I was having a subliminal perception, or I was having a contentless state of awareness. That's how people describe it. They know they are aware, but there is nothing in their awareness. So the hypothesis here is that you are never unconscious. You may not remember what you experienced, or your experience may not be metacognitive. In other words, you experience, but you don't know that you are experiencing. So you don't report that, even if you're asked. So there are many levels of experience that are impossible to report, even to yourself, or to remember. That doesn't mean that you were not experiencing. It only means that you were unresponsive, or forgetful, or unable to report. And that's all there is to it.
It's just so interesting when you make this shift of perspective, how it all falls into a very, very different order. Now, Bernardo, let's get into our main topic for today, the metaphysics of the hugely influential psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Now, Jung is one of my great heroes. He's a hero of this podcast, but he's also one of the greatest influences in your life and work, as well as the subject of one of your most recent books, Decoding Jung's Metaphysics, the Archetypal Semantics of an Experiential Universe. Now, the reason I'm particularly excited to speak with you about the implications of Jung's work is that you are, like he was, fundamentally an empiricist and a rationalist. So you're open scientifically to any phenomena we can see empirically in the world and in the psyche, but yet you're looking for a rational scientific explanation, very, very similar to our approach on this podcast. And the bottom line is, this podcast, we want to understand the most reasonable explanation for what reality is and how it works. So let's start earlier in his career, when he started to get into hypothesizing about the psyche and the unconscious, particularly in contrast to his teacher and mentor, Sigmund Freud. Jung was gathering this sort of statistically significant foundation, trying to prove the anecdotal evidence he'd gathered from his patients, to prove a wider theory of how our individual psyches interact with the archetypes residing in the collective unconscious. But his desire to maintain his scientific reputation was really in contrast to the implications of this theory, and I think he knew it. Describe to us his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious, and tell us about this tipping point in his life where he felt he had enough data to go public with something so controversial.
That was years after the breakup with Freud that happened in the 1920s. Freud thought of the so-called unconscious as a sort of a passive repository, a sort of a naughty corner for censored contents of consciousness, or a drawer where you put all of your repressed stuff. You put the skeleton in that cabinet. So the contents of the unconscious were all at some point conscious, but were then repressed, forgotten, whatever. So the unconscious was passive. For Jung, the unconscious was active. It was a sort of a fountainhead of psychic content. And those psychic contents would only become reportable if they were to cross the threshold of consciousness. Now, there is a terminology point that I need to make because it's crucial to understand Jung. Jung defined what he meant by consciousness. And it is today what we today would call metacognition. In other words, it's not only experiential, you have to know that you are experiencing it. And clinically, that was necessary for Jung because all he had were the reports of his patients. There was no neuroimaging. All he had were patient reports. And patients only report what they are meta-conscious of, consciously metacognitive of. Not only what they experience, but the experiences that they are aware that they are having. So it's a higher level mental function. And Jung was clear in that regard because he had three criteria for calling a psychic content conscious. One was that it had to be associated in a broader context in order to have meaning. And another one was that it had to be reportable. And there was a third one, but that's the point I want to make. So the unconscious is not for Jung the non-experiential. Jung would never say that. He used the word psychic in the sense that today we would use the word experiential. The unconscious was psychic, therefore it was experiential, but it was not reportable even to self. In other words, it was not metaconscious. For Jung, this spontaneous, instinctive psyche that produced spontaneous experiences had three levels, or two levels. One was a collective level, in which you and I would be just two islands of the same underwater mountain chain. From the perspective of someone above the water, we are separate, two islands. But if you would look deep into the collective unconscious, you would realize that it's not two islands at all. It's just two peaks of the same mountain chain. They are connected in the lower levels. So that was the collective psychic, the collective unconscious for Jung. It was the layer of the psyche in which we are not separate. They underlie all of our minds, but it's unconscious. It's not explicitly reportable. And then there is the personal unconscious, which is a part of that mountain chain that is already differentiated, but it's still underwater. You still cannot report on it. You don't know that you're having those personally unconscious experiences. And then there is consciousness, which Jung symbolically referred to as the light of metacognition. The experiences that not only you are experiencing, but you know that you are experiencing and therefore can report. But the key difference was that for Jung, this unconscious was creative. And for Freud, it was a passive repository of discarded former contents of awareness.
And tell us a little bit about the data that eventually he felt brave enough to put forward to his colleagues. Because well, first of all, just tell us about the data that gave him the push to actually write about this in an academic work.
The unconscious manifests itself in symbolic language. It doesn't speak English. It doesn't speak Chinese. These are higher level mental functions in the differentiated areas of the psyche. The unconscious can't speak a language. The language it speaks is the language of symbolism, the language of analogies, of metaphors, of images, as Jung put it. So when you have a dream that comes from the collective unconscious, comes from that impersonal layer of the psyche in which we are all connected, that dream expresses itself in symbolic language. And the data that Jung collected was data that allowed him to see that completely different people coming from completely different segments of society, completely different backgrounds, education, references, and so forth, would use the same symbology, would report dreams with the same symbolism. There was not only across patients, but across history. So Jung mentions explicitly one particular example of an insane person, and insanity is an expression of the unconscious as well. That's why it comes across as insane. It doesn't speak language. It's purely symbolic, and for the rest of us, that looks insane. So this patient from an insane asylum that used to say, well, the wind comes from the sun, comes from a tube that hangs from the sun. And depending on how you move your head, you can see that tube blowing the wind in different directions, which is insane, right? But it turns out that there are myths recorded in which our ancestors have spoken of the sun having a penis and the wind being blown from the sun's penis. And the imagery was identical. Now, that was published in the technical literature after Jung had heard the report from this insane asylum patient. So he immediately realized, okay, this patient couldn't have known that. And even if it was published before, slightly before, what's the chance that a patient in an insane asylum would have read very recent heavy-duty technical literature? None at all. So that's how he realized that this bottom layer of the unconscious is a collective one, because it doesn't matter who it's speaking through, it's using the same symbolism, and that symbolism could not have come from the normal life of different people, because there aren't these congruencies across the lives of different individuals, across geographies and across history.
And these interpretable forms he calls archetypes, is that right?
Each particular manifestation of the unconscious is not an archetype, but the underlying template, the pattern that constructs a particular manifestation, a particular image, a particular dream, that underlying pattern is archetypal. So we do not know the archetypes directly. We cannot know because, as Jung put it, they are empty. All we know are their manifestations. And these manifestations are self-consistent enough that we can realize that they all unfold from a similar set of underlying patterns. And those patterns, prior to each particular manifestation, are archetypal. They are the primordial templates according to which psychic energy flows, the primordial templates of our mental life. and therefore they precede any particular dream, any particular experience.
Now, we do have, listeners, a full episode on the collective unconscious with the brilliant Jungian analyst Monica Wickman, laced with scientifically salient quotes from Jung and extraordinary stories to illustrate the way this interaction works. So we don't need to dwell too long here, Bernardo, but I have to get your opinion on what were the implications of just this part, this collective unconscious archetype aspect of his theory at the time, before we get into his later, deeper concepts of individuation and synchronicity and active imagination, for example. But I'm keen to imagine how his students and colleagues would have seen the implications of this radical theory.
Oh, the key implication is that consciousness, what he called consciousness, we would call the ego, the metacognitive ego, he's not the master of the house. The ego is a little boat floating on top of a raging ocean of psychic activity that it cannot control. You can put the rudder pointing in a certain direction. You can even row, and that gets you somewhere. But that's a small causal force in an ocean of things that are not under the control of ego consciousness. So it's important to acknowledge that there is an ocean of psychic activity underlying our ego minds, and that we can't just take domain and control over it. There has to be a kind of dialogue, a kind of understanding. You have to understand what's going on in the deeper layers of your mind. Because if you don't, and you don't engage in dialogue with it, it will rule your life. And that's a quote, you will call it fate.
And I wonder if Jung would have, been considered a fatalist or somebody who didn't believe in free will.
That's a much more subtle and complicated topic. The notion of
we don't have to go there if you don't want to, because it is a long one, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't want to go to the deepest level, otherwise we'll talk about it for an hour.
Yeah.
But let's go just to the first layer of interpretation. We are not saying that that ego consciousness has no agency. That's not the claim. What we are saying is that it has the agency of a small boat rowing on a raging ocean. In other words, it does have agency, but it has to contend with much more powerful forces around it. That's the claim. And those much more powerful forces have tremendous causal influence. So your life is not determined purely by the small agency of ego consciousness. It's determined by the interaction between the small agency of ego consciousness and the big agency of the unconsciousness that underlies it.
Mm.
So it's not like you have no autonomy to make choices. It's just that your choices are within a context of a great many forces. So it's not only ego consciousness playing a role in this. There are bigger agencies there as well. And they too are you. You just don't identify with them at the level of ego consciousness.
Exactly. So this idea of a sort of repository of collective identity in the form of archetypes existing in template form beyond space and time, Monica posits this. I'd be interested to see if you also agree that this repository in some sense is beyond, outside of space and time. It seems classically idealist in a way, because it suggests that this repository is baked into the nature of reality. And so reality is in some sense psychic from the start. Was Jung an idealist? And if so, reluctantly or openly?
It depends on which Jung, at what part of his life.
Mm.
If you would have asked him 2 years before he died, I think he would have openly said, yeah, I'm a philosopher. I did philosophy. I mean, he's on record admitting to this later in his life. But if you would ask the Jung of 1912 or the Jung of 1922 or even the Jung of 1932, he would have said, no, I'm not a philosopher. I'm an empirical scientist. I leave philosophy to others. I deal with data. So which Jung are we talking about, right? Ultimately, He was very clearly an idealist, but to make a case for this takes a book-length treatment, which is what I did. I wrote a book about this. It's very hard to make a convincing argument for that in a few minutes during an interview. But to say something about it, the line that Jung took was first to realize that manifestations of the unconscious are archetypal. They fall along the lines of primordial templates that all human beings seem to share. The second step on that line was to realize that even the world around us responds to psychic states according to archetypal patterns. And he called it synchronicity. And now you're extending the archetypes beyond the underlying layer of human minds. You're extending it to the underlying layer of nature itself. Because even the behaviors of nature out there, animals, plants, rocks, planets, and moons, seem to unfold in resonance with the archetypal manifestations in our own minds. And that's the notion of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences between an internal psychic state and an external physical state. And then he started talking to Wolfgang Pauli about this. Pauli was a very famous physicist, the guy behind the Pauli principle, Nobel winner. And they speculated about a way to sort of accommodate this notion of archetypes manifesting in nature at large and accommodate that in the context of physics. And they came up with this notion that there are two dimensions of organizing principles in nature, and they are orthogonal. One is causality. Nature organizes itself according to chains of cause and effect. This is recognized by science. But there is another dimension perpendicular to causality, which is synchronicity, when things evoke one another, not causally, but through similarity of meaning. And then they went further at the very end, and this was almost left unsaid, but they were both very intelligent people, and they understand the implications of what they were saying. The room they found for synchronicities in physics was the fact that quantum level events are not causally determined at an individual level. Theories predict only large effects. You know, if you throw a coin multiple times, then the statistics will comply to a certain distribution of probabilities with certainty. But any single flip of the quantum coin is indeterminate. And it's that indeterminacy that opened room for synchronicity. Because you say, well, that's where synchronicity plays a role in nature that is orthogonal to causality. Individual quantum level events are not causal, so they are governed by synchronicity. But if you do that and you think about it more carefully, as Pauli and Jung did, you realize that causal effects are just aggregates of lower level quantum effects. Now, if I move my hand and I pick up my bottle, that's causality, right? Yes, but that's also the aggregate effect of gazillions of microscopic quantum level events. They are not separate things. And the ultimate conclusion is that causality itself is an aggregate effect of microscopic level synchronistic events. In other words, everything is synchronicity, even what passes by causality.
My God, that is the most beautiful interpretation of synchronicity and causality. I must
It's
go.
not mine, it's theirs. Huh?
Yeah.
I didn't come up with this.
And listeners, we have an excellent episode on synchronicity from quantum physicist and Jungian scholar Christophe Lemuel, where we unpack this fascinating relationship that Jung had with Pauli. We talk about the whole story. It's a really, really interesting story. And Pauli encouraged him to write about it because Pauli was like, we need to get this out. We need to talk about this. But Jung was resisting. He didn't want to go public with such a phenomenon that was so obviously idealist or panpsychist in its implication. Tell us the kind of data that that Pauli pushed Jung to write about. Tell him that famous paper on synchronicity. What sort of data did he put in to try and describe this?
Well, Pauli was Mr. Synchronicity. Synchronicity would happen around him. Stuff would break. Weird stuff would happen
The
around
Pauli
him.
effect. The Pauli effect. Yeah. People wanted him to be far away from their experiments. It was hilarious.
I would think that it was because of this personal experience that he couldn't dismiss the notion of synchronicity. Because it's one thing to dismiss something somebody else tells you. It's one thing to dismiss a conceptual abstraction. But when something is happening so consistently to you, even if you are not yourself going out to write about it, as Pauli did not do, he did not go out to write about synchronicity himself. He did not co-author Jung's paper on synchronicity. He's acknowledged as a contributor, but he didn't put his name on it. So that he did. But to him himself, when he puts his head on a pillow at night, I think he realized that, I cannot escape from this. And ultimately, it is a theoretically coherent notion. If archetypes manifest in us and in nature, then nature is mental, because archetypal is another word for mental. It's the premier mental notion, is the notion of archetypes. And therefore, the way nature unfolds is by analogy. That's how the primitive mind works. Before we have theories and conceptual narratives and the notion of literal descriptions, what we have is analogy. Like if I say time is a river, that's the kind of thing the primitive mind would say. And what it means is not that time is a river, literally. The primitive mind doesn't have the notion of something literal. What it means is there is something about time that is the same as something about a river. And you may say, well, it's flow, both flow. But the primitive mind doesn't have a concept for that similarity. It doesn't have the notion of flow. So it only thinks analogically or metaphorically, time's a river. And so it's a similarity at the level of meaning. And it's coherent to think that what we call causality is, in fact, a similarity at the level of meaning. It's an effect having a meaning. Sorry, it's a cause having a meaning. And that meaning is what we call the effect. So the whole thing is coherent. Now, the particular data underlying that paper on synchronicity that came out in the 1950s is not good. It's not strong. And Jung was very open about it. He tried to interpret astrology on a synchronistic basis. It didn't work very well. He tried to do something about data on marriages, when couples marry and what their profiles are, and that didn't work very well. So the data underlying synchronicity remains, or remained at the time, anecdotal, which is not a put down. Anecdotal means it's data collected under circumstances that were not controlled. But sometimes a few pieces of anecdotal data are so compelling, so mind-boggling, that they lead to theoretical breakthroughs. It's the idea of the black swan. If your theory is all swans are white, and you chance upon one black swan, well, that's anecdotal. You chanced upon one black swan. But anecdotal as it may be, it refutes the theory that all swans are white. And that's the spirit of synchronicity. A few anecdotal points that are so extremely compelling that they cannot be ignored. And look, Freddie, this is not an apology to synchronicity. And the reason I say this is that the very point of synchronicity is that there is an organizing principle underlying nature that is so broad that you cannot isolate under laboratory conditions. You can only isolate under laboratory conditions very localized and simple effects, such that you can control all variables of relevance. Synchronicity is something that is supposed to take place in the world at large. It entails the dynamics of cultures, of histories, of the entire physical context, of the meaning in the lives of different people. This is not something that you can coax into a laboratory experiment under controlled conditions. If you do that, you will exclude synchronicity, because synchronicity needs a grander context to unfold. So the fact that there is only anecdotal evidence for it is exactly what you would expect if synchronicity is true.
Absolutely. And so with these concepts in mind, this brings us to an important technique that Jung used with his patients. Listeners, bear in mind that all of his academic work was based on many, many years inside the private office with his patients. So everything had been tried and tested a million times before he actually wrote about it for his colleagues. And one of these techniques was active imagination. So if there's a non-causal connection between this internal phenomenal consciousness and the outside world, as his examples of synchronicity suggest, we're capable of actively interacting with what Jung called the imaginal field of physical reality. And in our collective unconscious episode, the psychoanalyst Monica Wickman told a story that literally you have to go back and listen to, listeners, because it will blow your mind. So she'd lost her 2-year fight against cancer, breast cancer. She was given 2 weeks to live. And she went into the desert to face her mortality. Not an easy thing to do. And started practicing active imagination, as she'd been trained to do. She was already training to be an analyst. And she had a vision of a scarab beetle burrowing deep into the earth. And she woke up the next morning, literally cancer-free, having had a spontaneous remission from all of the terminal cancer in her body. So tell us, Bernardo, how these implications of synchronicity lead logically to a conception of the outside world as a component of this imaginal field, which is compiled both physical and psychic elements that we can interact with at any time.
Jung spoke often of what he called the reality of the psyche, or psychic objectivity. And what he meant by that is that there are psychic dynamics that we can experience but cannot control. And therefore, they seem to be real in the sense of being outside us. And active imagination was an exercise in trying to evoke this kind of psychic objectivity, trying to open the door for spontaneous visions that we can't control, but yet we can witness, like dreams. We don't control our dreams, they happen to us. And like the physical world outside, when we are awake, we experience the physical world, but we can't control it. And this is the key realization that one has to come to understand Jung fully, even to an extent that he didn't explicitly write about. The physical awaking world, too, is an instance of psychic objectivity. It's very akin to a dream or to a spontaneous vision in active imagination, in the sense that it is imagery that unfolds, that you can witness, but you can't control. It's not under the control of your will, of your imagination as a conscious ego or a metaconscious ego. It's something that happens to you. And this is the great understanding, because if you understand this, then you realize that the collective unconscious is not only the agency behind your deepest dreams that you witness and you can't control. It's not only the agency behind the spontaneous visions that you have during active imagination, which you experience but you can't control. It is also the collective unconscious behind the spontaneous imagery that we call the physical world. It's exactly the same kind of thing experienced under different circumstances. And that's the understanding you need to accommodate synchronicity and to sort of make all the pieces fall in their right places when it comes to Jungian psychology.
But I mean, okay, so we can interact with it psychically, imaginally, but for those interactions to actually have causal power in the physical world is pretty controversial in our current materialist zeitgeist. Did Jung dare to speak out about the implications of this? It's basically mind-matter interaction. I mean, perhaps towards the end, did he speak out about this?
Well, he referred to scientific experiments done in the US EPR, not EPR, that's Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen. I'm not very familiar with the psychic, not the psychic, but the
Yes.
mind over matter literature. ESP, yeah. He referred to those. So in a sense, he was keeping an arm's length relationship with them because he was citing. He was not saying, I witnessed it myself, or I think that this is true. He was citing. But the mere fact that he did cite it suggests that at some level, at least, he took it very seriously. And there's no doubt that he took it very seriously. But keep one thing in mind. For Jung, just as for me, there is no such a thing as mind over matter, because there is no matter. What we call matter is an expression, a manifestation of mind coming from the collective unconscious that we can't control directly. That being the difference between matter and your fantasies, your deliberate fantasies, or your deliberate imagination, your non-active imagination, so to say.
Yeah, I love Pauli's, not Pauli, sorry, Planck's phrase for this, the mind-matter matrix. I think is a lovely way of sort of helping us bridge between these two very separate approaches.
Jung insisted that the psyche was, and he used an ancient Greek word for this, and that's a letter he wrote to Father White. And it's the most definitive expression of Jungian philosophy, and he wrote that in a letter. He used an ancient Greek word that is the only word of any language that is absolutely unambiguous about that particular meaning. And the Greek word was ousia. Ousia means a thing in itself, something that is not the effect of another, something that is its own substance, its own reality, something that isn't derived, isn't secondary, isn't epiphenomenal. No, it is primary. It is fundamental. That's the word philosophers today would use, an irreducible fundamental thing. And what did he consider to be an ousia? The psyche. He wrote to Father White, and that's a quote, "For me, the psyche is an ousia." So that's Jung saying that the psyche is primary. Matter is a kind of experience that emerges under certain circumstances from the psyche and for the psyche, but the psyche is fundamental. So what we call mind over matter is psyche over psyche. That's basically what it is.
Now, lastly on Jung, because I want to get on to the implications of how we can do science in the future if we can sort of integrate some of these implications. But don't worry, Jung fans, we've got a whole show on the shadow coming up and how to integrate it, hopefully with the famous Jungian analyst Jim Hollis. So the shadow's covered, don't worry, listeners. Really important theme. And Jim Hollis, incidentally, wrote the afterword to your book, right, Bernardo? Before we get into individuation, right, do you want to mention Jim Hollis's influence on your thinking and the relevance of his afterword to the book?
Well, James Hollis, Jim. I'll dare to call him Jim since you opened the door to that. Normally, I would.
Well, no,
I'm not that intimate with him, but
he refers to himself as that. So.
Jim is probably the most effective, the most nuanced, the most profound Jungian analyst alive, in my view. He's not trying to provide a theoretical or philosophical interpretation of Jung. Jim is interested in human life, the drama of human life, and how best to go about it. He has helped me a lot when I was going through that key life transition that normally goes by the name of midlife crisis or the Saturnian shadow. When I was going through that, his books helped me a lot. And therefore, insofar as they contributed to my sanity, they have indirectly contributed big time to my philosophy, because I need to be sane to do what I do.
And this crisis, was it quite? If you don't mind talking about it, Bernardo, like
I don't mind at all.
it was quite recent in the last few years, right?
No. Before I had any kind of interaction with Jim, I knew his books. I read his books. My big transition, well, a big transition, lasted the best part of 10 years. I was 34 years old, and I realized that I had achieved everything that I wanted to achieve when I was 14. Now, my father died, I was 12. And as a coping mechanism, by the time I was 14, I had a sort of a clear map for how my life should unfold. And that gave me some kind of ground to step on. And 20 years later, I was 34, and everything in that plan, in that map, was ticked. You know, I lived in my own freestanding house. I was the youngest executive director in the company I worked for, which is a Europe top 50 company. Youngest director. ASML was the company. It's becoming more famous now because it's so important. I was married to the love of my life. I had money in the bank. I thought I arrived. I have control. And then I realized I don't control anything. I found a nodule in the breast of my wife then. I'm no longer married with her. We are still friends. And took 2 weeks for doctors to say, this is not cancer. But during those 2 weeks, I profoundly internalized the notion that those 20 years of fighting for control were completely illusory. I never had, I don't have, and I never will have control. I am at the mercy of the ocean of life. And it was very hard to internalize that, because it required a completely different manual for life than the manual you get in the first half of life. And it's that transition to the second half of life that we don't have a manual for. Nobody teaches us that. Our doctors don't teach us, our parents don't teach us, and the news anchor, the 8 o'clock news doesn't teach us that.
But Jung teaches us that, doesn't
Jung,
he? He uses individuation, this really, really important idea. And it's this idea that somehow there is deeper meaning. There is some sort of teleological purpose, some reason to be. I guess that's the assumption, really, isn't it? So he developed the concept of individuation, that all of us were in some way heading towards this deeper sense of meaning, of understanding about the nature of our existence. Tell us more about this concept of individuation, what it means for the nature of reality, if it is built into nature, as Jung believed.
the first half of life is about carving out a place in the world for you as an ego. You know, a place to live, a role to play in society. The second part of life is completely different. It's not about carving anything out in the world. It's not about attaining control in the world. It's not about achievement. To me, and I'll speak out of my own experience now, because that's the only way to speak honestly about it. I'm not a psychotherapist. I don't see patients, so I can't be objective about it like Jim Hollis can be or Jung could be. So out of my own personal experience, for what it's worth, the second half of life is about not only understanding conceptually, but living the reality that you are not in control, that your life is not, has never been, and will never be about you, that you exist in nature as a segment of nature, perhaps not even a part of nature, and that it's about what nature is doing. That the best thing you can do to achieve meaning in your life is to find a way to relate to nature so as to allow nature to do through you whatever it is it's trying to do, even if you don't understand it. And that your role as an ego, or the usage of the ego as a tool, is to pass some degree of self-reflective moral judgment on what nature is trying to do through you. Because if you don't do that, you end up like Hitler. So you have to use the ability your ego has to be metacognizant, to pass moral valuations, in order to sort of steer that irresistible flow of nature, that impersonal flow of nature that is being channeled through you. And but beyond that, beyond passing that moral valuation that steers it in a way that is healthy for you and for society, beyond that, the impetus behind it and the agenda behind it, far beyond you as an individual, far beyond you as an ego. And finding what I call the freedom of the slave, which is the freedom to know that it's not about you, that you are servant of something that you can't even conceive of correctly, that making peace with it is the ultimate freedom. It's not the egoic freedom of I control everything. It's the freedom of the shackled slave that that knows it's not about it, that knows it doesn't have any control, and yet sees the validation of its existence as a tool of something that far, far surpasses and transcends it. That's the only way to be truly free and to have true meaning. And this will sound completely contradictory to somebody fighting to carve out space for themselves in the first half of life.
Well,
how can you free by not being free? How can you find meaning in realizing that life is not about you? And yet that's exactly what you find in the second half of life.
Well, it's a very Asian philosophical idea, isn't it? And it's no coincidence that Jung was very, very interested in Asian philosophy. But in Hindu society, this is actually built into their life path. So after you've had your kids and had your job, you arrive to a certain age. I can't remember. I think it's around 45, 50. And you literally pack up shop, sling a bag on your back and you just go. And you literally let go of everything that first part of your life was about, and you go off in search of enlightenment, I imagine is the word that they would use. But I think that there's no accident that there's a parallel between Jung's idea of individuation and this.
It's no surprise that there are similarities in what people have said across geographies and history, because reality is not fragile. We are bang in the middle of it. And that people at different times in different locations stumble upon the same facts of reality shouldn't come as a surprise at all, because they are real. Now, having said that, together with Jung, I would sound a note of caution regarding going too far in saying that Jungian psychology or Western philosophy are the same as Eastern psychology and Eastern philosophy. I think there are fundamental differences. For instance, the Indian you alluded to, he's departing the world. He's not only departing the references of the first half of life, he's going up to a cave in the Himalayas, meditating for the next 40 years of his life. That's not what Jung encouraged the Western psyche to do. The Western psyche is phenomenally engaged with the world. So the second part of life is not about leaving the world. No, it's about engaging the world at another level, a deeper level, understanding that the world is the impersonal that wants to manifest itself through you. So by allowing your life to take the direction imprinted on it by the impersonal, you are precisely engaging more with the world, as opposed to detaching yourself from the world as a separate entity. And I'm not saying that the Indian is wrong. I'm just saying that different psychological profiles have different ways of engaging with reality. To give you a more concrete example, Indians historically have not recorded history, while we in the West recorded everything. We know every king, we know every battle, we know who they married, what they did, especially the British. The Brits know all that about British history. The Indians didn't record all that. Why? Because for the Indian, the specific king doesn't matter. What matters is the archetypal king. The specific conflict or war doesn't matter. What matters is the archetypal war. Because the archetypal king and the archetypal war are the only true realities. The temporal king and the temporal war are circumstantial. But the Indian can do that because the Indian relates to myth in a way that we can't relate anymore. The Indian takes the myth seriously. So if you read Hindu literature, there is the archetypal king in there. There is the archetypal battle in there, and you take it seriously as an Indian. Therefore, you don't need history. We can't take mythology seriously. So our only way to interact with the archetype is through the particular manifestations of the archetype, the particular king, the life of Henry VIII, all the women he went to bed with and beheaded. That's what we need, because the archetypal king in our mythology, we don't take seriously. We equate myth with untruth. So we need the history, you see? So for the Western mind, it's important to be engaged with history, to have traditions, to honor the ancestors, to understand our lives as the tip of a spear that has been traversing time for countless generations. That's what couches our life with meaning and significance and purpose. It's our history. It's where we come from, and the role we'll play in bringing it to where it's going to go next. For the Indian, that's not how it goes. The Indian couches their lives in the context of archetypal mythology. For us, that would not work. For them, what we do doesn't work. So both are valid, but you cannot transplant one to the context of the other and think that you can get away with it. And Jung was very explicit on this. And so I would like to resonate with Jung here, echo Jung's word, because I think it's important. I don't think it's healthy for a Western mind like mine to think that in the second half of life, I should go up and live in a cabin in the Alps. Make no mistake, I am highly tempted to do this. Goodness knows how tempted I am to leave the world behind. I can do that. I could do that. I've reached the point in my life where, for all practical purposes, I have the means to completely withdraw from the world and go live in a cabin in the Swiss Engadine. And you would never see me again. I'm highly tempted to do that. But that's not my path. That's not what the impersonal through me is trying to do. The impersonal through me wants precisely to engage with the world, not leave the world. And I honor that.
Absolutely. And it's a very important point that parallels are by no means connections. But the point I wanted to come back to, you mentioned that, was talking about this crisis, the fact that very often we see in the sort of psychological path of our lives, we see these continuous falls. A good image of it, although I think it's slightly overrated, is Joseph Campbell's sort of hero's journey, that we have these constant sort of dark night of the soul where, after a period, we then have to face yet another crisis and yet another crisis. And I think individuation, it was Jung's answer to how to navigate those crises as a tool and see them as a really, really useful opportunity to look deeper into everything that the world and our dreams and our psychic life is offering to navigate that experience. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I think understanding life as a kind of a circumambulation of a core, of a psychic core, the place where the treasure is buried in the garden, circumambulating that as a sort of a guide or a manual for the second half of life is useful. It is certainly helpful. The key difference from the first half of life is that in the first half of life, you think you're going forward, that you make linear progress. And in the second half of life, you understand that it's not a straight arrow pointing forward, it's a spiral. You come back to where you were before, but at a higher level of consciousness, and you circumambulate that again, and again you come back to where you were before, but at a higher level, you detect more nuance, you have more context for that experience you're returning to. So each time you circumambulate, you are richer, and life is no longer about an arrow and a destination. the point where you want to be. That doesn't work anymore in the second half of life. The problem is that many of us don't know how to do it any differently. The only manual, the only recipe they ever had was the one for the first half of life. So what you see is that a lot of people keep on insisting on that because they don't know how to play the game in a different way. So if they get, by the time they're 40 and they have their 1.5 million, now they want the 10 million. And after that, they want the 100 million. And they already have a house. And now they want the second house. And after that, they want the yacht. And after their wife, they want the trophy wife. And after that, they want the girlfriend. And so they insist on that. And then you get a Rupert Murdoch, you see, or a Donald Trump.
Surprising that they think that that will lead to happiness. You would have thought that the first yacht or the first million would have shown them, well, if I'm not happy with that, then I'm obviously, this route isn't going to get me there.
For people who are paying attention and have developed the minimum level of maturity, grabbing the first ghost lets you immediately see that there's nothing there. Your fingers just run through it. There was nothing there to begin with. And then you may try it again and maybe 3 times more until you realize that there is no point. But some people are puer aeternus. They are teenagers forever. And because we are in an adolescent culture, we reify the old teenagers amongst us.
The big kids. Totally agree.
Yeah.
So with individuation, I'm kind of attaching this individuation to this idea in philosophy of teleology, of purpose, and of, meaning in that sense. And this is something that keeps coming up on the show, the possibility that the universe itself has teleology, a reason to be, a purpose-directed existence. And, from beyond this dissociative boundary, if we're talking about the mind at large, that seems like quite a logical idea. Does Jung's research suggest that as dissociated conscious agents, we are in some sense part of a wider, unseparated collective teleological process?
Yes, but then I have to qualify this. Most people associate the notion of teleology or purpose with the notion of a deliberate vision about where we want to be.
Back to control again. Yeah.
When you have worked out your plan and you weighed the pros and cons and you say, okay, this is where I want to be, and that's my telos. That's not how natural teleology works. Natural teleology, the teleology that comes from the collective unconscious, is spontaneous teleology. In other words, it's not the result of a deliberate plan or a deliberate vision. It's more a game of I'm getting warmer or I'm getting colder. It's an instinctive notion of destination and purpose. If you're going in the right direction, it feels good. If you take a wrong turn, it feels bad. In other words, you don't really know where you want to get. You only know if you are getting closer or further away. It's spontaneous in that sense. This doesn't mean that there isn't a specific telos. It may be, but it may not be metaconscious. And it's not metaconscious, otherwise it would be in the ego and not in the collective unconscious. So there is an implicit purpose built into the fabric of nature, the fabric of the collective psyche, that nature at large is not directly aware of or explicitly aware of, but it senses it intuitively, instinctively. We are the only game in town as far as trying to English that purpose, make it explicit, because we are metacognitive. Nature at large is not. Evolution has battled for 4 billion years to produce metacognitive entities like we are. So we should play our role, and part of our role is to try to identify in this intuitive and instinctive sense of purpose what the purpose actually is, and put words to it. And I think that's self-awareness, it's self-knowledge, which Jung referred to as individuation. But bringing the unconscious into consciousness, all the aspects of it.
The question that has sort of keeps coming up on the show and has been suggested by a few of the interesting thinkers we've spoken to is this idea that in some sense, the mind at large, as you call it, created these dissociated conscious agents almost to multiply its potential for exploring that telos. And as a computer scientist, I thought that maybe you might have you might quite like this analogy, because it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you set up a whole bunch of simulations rather than just one, then you're going to get much more data and you're going to get to what it is you're looking for faster. Do you think that it could, in some sense, be that these conscious agents aren't separated by chance, that actually it's speeding up the job of lowering entropy and raising the consciousness level that you spoke about just now?
I think this may be true in metacognitive hindsight, but notice that you are appealing again to deliberate metacognitive planning. The thinking is you're the mind of nature, and the mind of nature reasoned this out and thought, it would do good to me if I produce all these dissociated alters, because then it's like multiple simulations at the same time. I don't think the mind of nature has the metacognitive capacity to think this through and arrive at this deliberate plan on how to go about things. I think it's a spontaneous mind. It chanced upon this. And once it chanced upon this, then it's holding on to it. To speak the language of science, the universe chanced upon life, the first life, abiogenesis, life from non-life. And once it took a taste for it, then life became quite an impetus. It appears everywhere. Whatever life can be, it seems to be. In the deepest, hottest, highest pressure geothermal vents to acidic lakes, life is everywhere. It's amazing, the impetus of life. It pops everywhere where it possibly can. So I think, having taken a taste for what life means, there is a lot of impersonal psychic energy in the fabric of nature going into the game of life. The more skeptical biologists may say, well, no, it's just evolution by natural selection. It's the life that is hardy is the life that evolved. That's why life is everywhere. And that may be true. But if I give myself some form of poetic license to talk about it in anthropomorphic, mythological terms, I would say, well, there is quite a big impetus in the mind of nature towards life, even if it's because of evolutionary reasons. That impetus is clearly there now. And part of it may be what you said. Nature senses that if it sort of fragments itself into multiple seemingly separate perspectives, the process enriches itself quicker, more and more efficiently.
It definitely seems a strong possibility. I won't go as far as say a likely one. Now, Bernardo, I'm really happy you brought it back to science there, because for the last part of our talk, I want to take all of these sort of, in my opinion, empirically very justifiable phenomena and Jung's, in my opinion, reasonable theories about them, and put them into a context of our sort of modern scientific zeitgeist with all its great material advances and all of the associated anomalies and unanswered questions. And I think maybe Jung's theories can help propose some new perspectives that might help us put to bed some of the main outstanding mysteries in science, namely the big three: the mystery of the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of consciousness. So I want to start with physics, as I know, as you probably know, that on the show we're covering in depth the integration of the implications of quantum phenomena into Western philosophy and science, or the non-integration, depending on who you're listening to. Bernardo, you're an ex-employee at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, and you've got a PhD in artificial intelligence, computer science. So you're in a really, really unique place to help us do this. So just give me a second to sort of set the scene here. Now, Christopher Lamel, as I mentioned, is an ex-quantum physicist, and he's a Jungian scholar at the Jung Institute in California. And in our interview about synchronicity, he said that modern physics wasn't even nearly ready to incorporate such a deep and interconnecting understanding of this sort of mind-matter matrix into its worldview. But I feel that part of your work at the Essentia Foundation, Bernardo, is pushing back against this preconception. You're suggesting that there is a more parsimonious and, in fact, rational and scientific foundation for discussing these phenomena if we're only brave enough to let go of some of our materialist assumptions. Now, my question to you is, how do you go about reassessing those assumptions scientifically? And then using that foundation, how do you explain the two big quantum quandaries that have troubled modern science for the last 100 years, entanglement and the measurement problem?
These are two quite broad and different questions. So I'll start
well,
with
it's more the foundation. How do we reassess the assumptions? And then with those reassessed, how do we reassess what blatantly hasn't really been properly understood in entanglement and the measurement problem?
Okay. So I'll start with the disclaimer. Idealism is the notion that the world is mental, but not all in your mind. So there is a world out there separate from your individual mind. But that world too is mental, just like my thoughts are mental, but they are outside your individual mind. So by saying that everything is mental, I am not necessarily saying that your individual mind can have direct control over the whole of nature. Clearly, that's not the case. The world will not be something different just because I fantasized it to be different or because I repeated my affirmations 1,000 times every morning. There is an autonomy to the world that is empirically undeniable. And Jung himself honored that. In fact, he brought that autonomy of the world into this personal psyche when he said that even our dreams or the manifestations of the collective unconscious, those two are things that we cannot control. They are psychically objective. They have a reality of their own, an autonomous reality. So idealism is not directly an open door for people who want to believe that if they visualize or repeat affirmations that they can change reality. That's not what idealism says. Now, I will acknowledge one thing. Between idealism and materialism, which one is more amenable to that possibility? Well, that's idealism. I grant that. Materialism would completely discard that hypothesis. Under idealism, that hypothesis is weak on empirical grounds, but not on fundamental grounds. Under idealism, your individual mind is a dissociative process in a broader mind. So the separation between your mind and the world is merely apparent. It's a form of illusion, a dissociative illusion. But the dissociation is there. And because of it, it's not a given fact that you can change the world by wishing it to be different. You're still dissociated from the world. So your wishes, your fantasies, your visualizations, they are within the dissociative boundary. And as such, they cannot directly or causally impact the mental processes on the other side of the dissociative boundary. Ergo, you can't change the world simply by imagining it or wishing it to be different. But then again, no process in nature is perfect, neither is dissociation. So idealism does open a sort of a slit on the door for some of those kinds of effects to be plausible, for some form of visualization or attitude towards life actually having a causal effect in the world. It's not something I can discard, but I don't want to swing the door wide open to it because that's not what idealism does. So that's the disclaimer. Now, regarding the two conundrums, you've mentioned quantum entanglement. What was the other one?
And the measurement problem. Yeah, the
measurement problem.
The two big unanswered ones.
Yeah.
So the question is, by changing, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered the movement in perspective, the change in the assumptions, but just describe then somebody who has worked as a professional quantum scientist, how your assumptions completely change the way you would explain those phenomena. Okay.
So first I will illustrate the problem, and then I will explain how idealism can provide a way or an avenue to try to solve the problems.
Perfect.
The measurement problem is the following. When you make a measurement of a system, you get a specific answer, like a specific number of grams or a specific number of meters. Actually, this whole thing is microscopic. So in fact, we are talking about angular momentum and other more subtle things, but for the general understanding, when you measure the world, you get a physical result, a physical quantity, a physical number as a result of that measurement. But before you measure it, we cannot say that the world has those physical properties because experiments contradict this. In other words, physical quantities like grams or kilometers or hertz or coulombs, joules, seconds, physical quantities can only be said to exist if you look. If you are not looking, experiment shows us that we cannot say that those physical quantities were there before measurement. In other words, measurement doesn't simply unveil a pre-existing physical reality. Measurement seems to create that physical reality. Before you measure, the world doesn't seem to be physical, which then raises this discombobulating question. What is it that you measure? If physicality is the result of measurement, what is it that you measure? It can't be physical because physicality is what arises from the act of measurement. So what is it that you measure? Now, we can't conceive of anything other than physical stuff. So we get down some rabbit holes of speculation that are completely nonsensical. And I'm not going to get into that, but that's one problem. That's the measurement problem. The other problem is entanglement, which is, as it turns out, if there are two entangled particles, let's say, and scientist Bob is measuring particle B in the US, and scientist Alice is measuring particle A in Australia. And they make their measurements at exactly the same time. And they can't communicate with one another because they're far away. It turns out that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A determines what Bob sees when he measures particle B. Darn. How can that be? If particles A and B are what they are prior to measurement, then Alice's choice of what to measure cannot change what particle B is. Because particle B was already particle B before Alice decided what to measure, right? So how can it be that what Alice happens to choose to measure determines exactly what Bob sees? And that's what we see in experiment. This happens. This is true. This has been repeated countless times for 45 years now. That's the other problem. If you are a materialist or a physicalist, there is no way out of this conundrum because what exists is physical stuff. So if physicality is the result of measurement, then what did you measure? You don't have an answer for that. There's nothing but the physical. So how can it be? The other assumption you make is that physical entities like particles A and B, they have fundamental existence. So they are what they are, regardless of what we measure about them, or when we measure, or if we measure. So how can it be that Alice's choice changes what Bob sees? You're lost in the woods if you're a physicalist. And you start entertaining all kinds of absurd fictions, like bazillions of parallel physical universes arising every infinitesimal fraction of a second for no reason, for which we have absolutely zero empirical evidence. Or
hidden variables.
Or the hidden variables of superdeterminism that no theoretician has even specified what they might be. They just wave their hands and say, there must be some variable that we don't know that does whatever needs to be done for us to make sense of these results. Yeah, okay. That's the ultimate in prejudice. You are forcing nature to be like your theoretical expectations would like nature to be. It has nothing to do with changing your expectations so they conform to what nature is showing you nature is. Now, how idealism can help solve this? Under idealism, the physical world is a representation. We don't see the world as it actually is. And we can know that with high confidence because if we were to see the world as it actually is, our inner state would mirror the entropy of the world, which has no upper bound. Therefore, just by looking at the world, we could melt into hot meat soup. Nobody has ever spontaneously melted into hot meat soup by looking at the world. Therefore, we don't see the world as it actually is. What we see is like a dashboard on an airplane. We are inside an airplane that has no windows. It only has sensors to measure the world outside and a dashboard of instruments to display those measurement results to us. And we fly by instruments. And we have to take the dashboard seriously, otherwise the airplane crashes. We are flying by instruments. The dashboard is what we see, is the screen of perception. It's the physical world. The physical world is a dashboard representation of the world that we are measuring through our sense organs, our retinas, eardrums, taste buds, inner lining of the nose and surface of the skin. We measure the world. And the results of those measurements are presented to us in the form of a dashboard that we call perception, the physical world. But the thing that is measured is not physical. Physicality is the result of a measurement, is the result of an observation. And you see how this dovetails very nicely with what experiments are telling you. The states of the world are not physical states. Physical states are what arises from measurement. And then you may ask, is it at all coherent to speak of states that are not physical? Let's first define, what is a physical state? A physical state is a state that can be exhaustively described through quantities alone. In other words, if you give a long enough list of numbers, you will have said everything there is to be said about that state. That's a physical state. Are there conceivable states that are non-physical? In other words, states that you cannot exhaustively describe through numbers alone. Of course there are. We come across them every single day. What is the length in meters of a thought? What is the weight in kilograms of an emotion? What is the angular momentum of an intuition? You see, endogenous experiential states are not describable through physical quantities. Ergo, they are not physical states. Ergo, the world is made of experiential states, endogenous experiential states. And measurement translates those experiential states through an interaction into our internal dashboard states, which we call the physical world in the framework of space-time. This makes sense of the measurement problem. Physicality indeed only arises through measurement, because an internal representation on a dashboard only arises if you measure the sky outside. If the airplane is not measuring the sky outside, the dashboard shows nothing. Does that mean that there is no sky outside? Of course not. It only means that you're not measuring. So if you don't make a measurement, there is no physical world. Nothing is on the dashboard. Does it mean that there is nothing to measure? Of course not. It only means that what you measure is not physical. And for you to have a physical world, in other words, for you to have indications on the dashboard, you have to make a measurement. There you go. The measurement problem can be made sense of. What about entanglement? What about entanglement? Imagine that you're a soccer fan and you cannot go to the stadium, so you have to watch the soccer game from home. And you are such a fan that you buy 2 television sets. And in one set, you're going to watch the game via Sky, and in the other one via BBC Sports. And you watch the same game at the same time on those 2 televisions side by side in your living room. Now assume also that Sky has different cameras in the stadium than BBC Sports. So the images on the 2 TVs will be different, but they will be mutually consistent because they're images of the same game, right? Are you with me?
Absolutely.
Okay, now imagine that a time traveler from the 19th century comes to visit you. For the first time, he goes to the future and he comes to your living room. And he sees the little man running around inside the 2 boxes in your living room. And there is a space between the 2 boxes. They're not connected. So the little man in one box cannot communicate to the little man on the other box. Yet when the little man on one box runs to the left, a little man on the other box runs to the right at the same time in perfect synchronicity. Perfect synchronicity. What happens in one is completely correlated with what happens in the other box. The little man on the 2 boxes seem to know instantaneously where the little man on the other box is going to go or what it's going to do. That's a miracle. That's entanglement. That's how Alice's measurements are completely correlated with Bob's measurements, even though Alice and Bob cannot talk to one another and don't talk to one another. What is the error of the time traveler? Why does the time traveler think this is a miracle? It's because the time traveler thinks that the images on the televisions are the thing in itself. The time traveler thinks there are little men inside the box, that there is a real game, that the image is the game. While you know that the images are just that, they're just representations, that the real thing is happening at the stadium. And those are two representations of the same real thing. That's why they are aligned. It's not miracle at all. The TVs don't need to talk to one another. You just have to understand that what you are seeing is not the soccer game in itself. It's an image thereof, a representation thereof. The same for entanglement. Those physical particles, the entire physical world, is not the world in itself. These are representations thereof, images on our internal television screen. The real world is not physical. There are no particles in the real world. And Alice's and Bob's measurements are correlated because both are images of the same underlying reality. And therefore, the correlation doesn't need communication, for the same reason that the TVs don't need to communicate with one another. All they need is to be representing the same underlying reality, the soccer game in the real stadium. Now, what is the common underlying reality between two entangled particles? Well, that's the mystery.
Absolutely.
That's the question.
And it's a beautiful mystery, which this dissociative boundary sort of deprives us of. But it's really similar. Listeners, we have an excellent episode with the theoretical physicist Chris Fields on entanglement, which you must go back to. And he comes to a very, very similar conclusion. Beautiful analogy there. Another point that I want to get your opinion on, keeps coming up on the show, is this tension between the relativity of time, i.e. that there is no universal time, but only local time. Listeners, do listen to the episodes from physicist Carlo Rovelli and the other one on Einstein, Paul Davies, on these topics, because they really, for physicists, it's quite normal, but it really helps us as members of the public start to integrate the flexibility of space and time as variables alongside everything else out there in the universe. So this tension between the relativity of time on the one hand and the theory of evolution on the other. Now, it seems to me that theory of evolution, the most agreed on scientific theory of all history, is distinctly bound to a concept of linear time. So from your point of view, how do we reconcile this incredibly compelling theory of evolution as a step-by-step progression from complexity in the universe leading to the evolution of life and eventually to the evolution of metaconsciousness? How do we reconcile that with this really confusing relativistic theory of time?
Everything we know in both analytic philosophy and now foundations of physics with loop quantum gravity indicates that space-time is not fundamental. In other words, it's not a pre-existing scaffolding of the world that is out there and wherein everything unfolds. Space-time is, in fact, epiphenomenal. It's secondary. It's not there from the beginning, which is a half pun, because beginning already presupposes time. Space-time arises from quantum level processes. In other words, they're derivative. They can be reduced to something that is itself not spatio-temporal. Everything indicates that space and time are, there is a sense in which space-time is an illusion. And that sense being it's reducible, it's secondary, it's not primary, it's not fundamental, it's not foundational. But even in that case, let's define some language so I can talk about it. Let's say that there is a primordial reality that's not in space-time. That's the truth outside space-time. We cannot be directly acquainted with that truth because space-time is built into our cognitive system. That's actually what space-time is. it's a cognitive system. You know, Kant already said that over 200 years ago, 250 years ago. It's coming out. They are cognitive instruments, so to say. So even to think or speak, we presuppose space-time. In language, the distinction between subject and object is spatial. The distinction between and actions are temporal, because actions are events that unfold in time. So verbs are temporal, subjects and objects are spatial. So the whole thing is built into language. And there is no coherent way for us to think without presupposing space-time. Causality itself presupposes space-time. I'm exaggerating. There is a way to think about outside space-time, but we don't have time to go there. And we would need to speak for an hour to get into that. But pretend that what I said is true. It's largely true. It's 99% true. So we cannot contemplate that primordial reality directly. What can we contemplate? What we can contemplate are the projections of that primordial reality onto the framework of space-time. We are seeing the shadows of the primordial reality, the projections in Plato's cave. You see what I mean?
So
if you have a cylinder,
some kind of time behind the appearance, the representation of space-time, there must be some other primordial time. That's what you're suggesting.
No, there is something primordial, not primordial time. Otherwise, we get into a recursion here. There is a primordial truth that is projected onto space-time, giving rise to the empirical world. In other words, the empirical world is a projection of something that really is true onto space-time. That's the only way you can coherently conceive of space-time as not being fundamental, which is what everything is indicating now in both science and philosophy.
Absolutely.
Now, a projection is like a shadow. If you have a statue and you put a light behind it, and you look at the shadow projected on your wall, you will see a contour of the statue. Now, that shadow, that contour is not the statue, but it does carry information about the statue. Because if you had put a different statue there, you would have gotten a different contour. Projections are not the thing projected, but they convey true information about the thing projected. Yeah? Finally, I'll give you an answer to your question. Evolution is a projection. The notion of evolution, although not literally true, says something true about what's going on. So we don't just discard evolution. Because even if time is not fundamental, and therefore evolution cannot be literally true in the way we like to think of it, even in that case, even if it is a spatio-temporal projection of something, it is saying something true about that ultimate truth. So this is a penultimate truth, a reducible truth, but a truth nonetheless. Evolution is true. The Big Bang is true, just not true in the naive, ultra-realistic sense that we used to think of until a few decades ago. We have to be a little bit more mature about it. But in being more mature, the worst error that we could make is to now say evolution isn't true, and neither is the Big Bang. They are true. They are true in a very, very important sense, just not that naive sense we used to think.
Okay, I like that. It's not satisfactory because we've got no way of sort of assessing to what extent it is an accurate projection, but it definitely feels right, doesn't it? Now, one of the other things I want to talk about, Bernardo, we've already actually touched on it, but we spoke about this interaction between the collective unconscious and the psyche of the dissociated agent. So we're seeing these interactions outside in the physical world, inside our psyche as well. And one of the other areas of anomalous phenomena we're covering on the show are these so-called psi phenomena, like precognition, telepathy, remote viewing, and mind-matter interaction that we spoke about. And we're speaking to one of the leading scientists in this field, Dean Radin, in this series. He's even been quoted by the skeptic psychologist Ray Hyman, alongside the statistics professor Jessica Utz, as providing some of the most convincing evidence for the existence of psi phenomena. For any listeners curious, do go and check out that episode to really hear if there is proper experimental evidence. As much as Bernardo rightly said, it's very, very difficult to bring this into the lab. There is some very, very surprising evidence that I was really, really shocked. Having never really heard about this field, I was very, very shocked. It's not given more sway in science. Now, I mention this, Bernardo, because I noticed that you chose the parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove as the author of the foreword of your book on Jung. And in that foreword, like so many others have before, Jeffrey talks about the possibility of the imaginal field and the collective unconscious as a sort of means by which anomalous cognition of otherwise non-causally connected events might pass. And Jung himself, as we said, was very, very open to these phenomena because he'd heard about them from his patients. Even the phenomena of military UFO experiences now becoming much, much more studied after the recent change of American law to give transparency to this whole field. Famously called both physical and psychic by the physicist Jacques Vallée, who was commissioned by the US government to write about it. Even this has been hypothesized to be some kind of manifestation of the collective unconscious. What's your take on these claims, Bernardo? Is it too facile an explanation to sort of bunch all of these anomalies under one big Jungian umbrella?
No.
Both physical and non-physical, both psychic and non-psychic. It seems almost too broad and convenient, almost sloppy scientifically, yet somehow plausible.
Yeah, the cumbersomeness that you detect correctly is the cumbersomeness that naturally occurs when a reigning worldview proves to be inadequate and we still don't have a strong footing on a better hypothesis, and everything becomes cumbersome. Language becomes cumbersome. The way we apply words becomes cumbersome. That's what you're seeing. But ultimately, nature is one thing. Nature does not have as its ontic structure our epistemic or linguistic structure. We projected stuff on nature. Nature is just what it is. It's one thing. Regarding psi phenomena, I'll start with a confession. I'm not particularly interested in them. And the reason is that I am too keenly aware of the great mystery that ordinary phenomena constitute. The ordinary world, in the way I experience it, is a mystery with untold depth. So I don't get a kick with less ordinary things or more rare things because I'm so overwhelmed by the mystery of the ordinary that the extraordinary for me is a footnote. So I don't read psychic or psi literature. Having said that, I will make a couple of comments. I have great respect for Dean Radin. And I think he's more than onto something. I think he has proven a thing or two by now. And our resistance to acknowledging that is entirely based on cultural prejudice. And some of the phenomena that go under the label psi are so common as to be banal, like precognitive dreams. It doesn't mean that all of your dreams are precognitive. The majority is not. But that every now and then precognitive dreams occur is banal. If you pay attention, you will see it. Or the sense of being stared at, banal, it's happening all the time. Certain intuitions about someone not being okay, banal stuff, it happens. Or animals knowing when their owners are coming home, which is the experiment that Rupert Sheldrake carried out. And that experiment was shot at by a number of different people. But if you just pay attention to your own life, your own pets over the decades, banal, that stuff happens. And we fight over it just because it doesn't fit a bankrupt worldview that still seems to be prevalent in our culture. Less and less, a lot changed over the past 15 years, but it's still prevalent.
But this imaginal field idea, could it be a hold-all sort of, shall we say, a sort of new science of consciousness kind of approach that could offer some sort of new route to sort of slowly, this is part of what I'm trying to do on the podcast, is sort of just slowly cajole the materialists to soften their assumptions.
I think reason and evidence are the ticket. That's how you move to the next worldview. It's when reason and evidence become so strong against your current assumptions that you can't help. And we have reached that stage. So the transition will happen. I am not very romantic about the new worldview. But that's a personality trait. I tend not to use names like the imaginal realm. I prefer to use more vanilla terms like nature. That's what nature is.
That's what it is.
And the existence of psi, I account for it in also non-romantic terms. Look, the separation between our individual minds and the rest of nature is a dissociative boundary that arises from a dissociative process in one and the same mind. And no process in nature is perfect. The water on the streets doesn't dry immediately after it stops raining. No fire combusts everything there is to burn. No process in nature is perfect. So dissociation isn't either. There will be some discrete, modest, experiential traffic across the dissociative boundary. And more so when that traffic is not obfuscated by the self-reflective ego. In other words, in liminal states, in hypnopompic or hypnagogic states, or in moments of great stress, great emotional engagement, when your self-reflective self is sort of out of the picture and it's not obfuscating that more subtle traffic across the dissociative boundary. Some people are much more capable of tuning into that than others. I have particular difficulty with it. I need high dose psychedelics to sort of weaken my dissociative boundary. But for some people, it comes very naturally. And to me, this is not romantic. It's not a point to go like, oh my God, so amazing. No, nothing in nature is perfect. Why would dissociation be? It's perfectly natural that there are so-called psi phenomena a little bit here and there when the circumstances are right. Probably not under laboratory circumstances, because the experience of being in a laboratory, an instrument that probably is the ultimate obfuscation for that very subtle traffic that needs an emotional engagement to happen. But I think it's banal. Now, to finally complete my answer to your question, the UAP phenomenon. I have great respect for Jacques Vallée as well, for his historical production over the decades. I think what that shows us very clearly is that whatever the agencies are behind the UAP phenomenon, they know something about reality that we don't know. They know, for instance, how to not be under inertial constraints. Inertia doesn't apply to them. So they know that space-time is not fundamental. They know how to get around it. Is that astronomically amazing? No, because by now we know that space-time is not fundamental. That some other agency has figured out this before us and figured out a way to go around it. It's like, yeah, okay. Your 19th century visitor would be amazed at mobile telephony and internet and, doing a Wikipedia search or a Google search on your phone. It's magic. But 100 years ago, only it would have been magic. Now it's banal. Getting rid of inertial constraints. Amazing. Today, because we have this artificially constraining worldview that tells us this should be impossible. Well, the Aboriginals thought radio waves would be impossible, flight would be impossible. Our worldview has changed, and what was impossible now is banal. And so we'll be operating outside the inertial constraints maybe 100 years from now. I don't know. Somebody has gotten there first, and we see them doing their job. That's cool. I would like to know who they are, that's for sure.
And that brings us beautifully on to the last point I wanted to get your opinion on, Bernardo, and thank you so much for staying with us for such a long time. I really wanted to get your opinion on something that I talk with in this series with the astronomer Avi Loeb, and it's quite close to what you were just talking about perspective. And it's important because it sheds light on the kind of openness required to understand thinkers like Jung, who were so clearly ahead of their time. Now, Avi and I discussed how, considering that our star is millions of years younger relative to the majority of the stars in the Milky Way, then it's not only really likely, it's highly probable that there are civilizations around many of those stars, but it's also likely that they would be millions of years ahead of us in terms of their technological advancement. Now, given that we're only 150 years into developing technology, and we've already had 3 industrial revolutions, you can see how hard it is for us to imagine, to make that sort of leap. And Avi argues that civilizations with millions of years of technological advancement beyond our own would appear more or less completely unfathomable to our top scientists today. I mean, he even jokingly imagined that I thought you'd like, Bernardo, that their technology could be so advanced that they were even able to evolve entire biological universes in their labs. So why do I mention this now to close, Bernardo? It seems to me that we need that same kind of humility in the face of the unknown when dealing with the psyche and with the collective unconscious. Although I hate the mechanistic analogy, in some way, it feels wiser to consider nature a bit like an advanced technology that we don't understand yet, rather than this sort of meaningless hunk of rock that we now call the universe and the stars and the planets. And at least if we regard reality as evidence of a highly evolved, advanced consciousness way beyond our own, we can get back to sort of remaining open to the new data and updating our theories, as we slowly learn about this vast field of the unknown. As it stands, we just seem to have this sort of arrogant and conservative credulence in our previous assumptions. Now, physicist Christophe Moelle said on Synchronicity that science had no tools to access the depth and far-reaching implications of this phenomena. But if we think long and hard, why shouldn't it one day? And I feel that your approach, Bernardo, strict reason married with humble empiricism, could really open the door to a new scientific method. Your closing thoughts on this sort of humility and your hopes for the future?
I think the strength, the reliability of science resides in its limited applicability. The limitation of the applicability of the scientific method is precisely what renders it extremely strong, compelling, and reliable. The problem is that we in our culture, our technological success has been so quick and so vast, and we attribute that to science, which is partly correct, largely even correct, that we think all fruitful approaches for developing knowledge about reality have to go under the label science. And I think this is a cultural artifact. I don't think this is justified at all. I think if we try to push every methodology we may, every fruitful methodology we may develop for gathering knowledge about nature, if we try to push all that under the label science, we will distort science to a point where we will lose it. We will lose its strength. So I think it's more progressive for us to keep science as maybe the biggest tool that we have, but use other tools as well. But not distort science, not try to abuse science by pushing under its skirts things that are contradictory with some of the methodologies or some of the boundary conditions or the principles that underlie science. For instance, first-person insight doesn't fit into the scientific methodology because the strength of that methodology is precisely in the objectivity of measurement. Does that mean that we have to abandon first-person insight as an avenue to understand something about reality? Of course not. First-person insight is the royal avenue for gathering knowledge about reality. Even if you say it only gathers knowledge about you, well, you are part of reality. Not only that, you are a carrier of all reality you can ever know as a living being. So if first-person insight gives you allows you to develop knowledge about yourself, that's a lot of knowledge already. But I wouldn't call that science. I wouldn't distort or abuse the name science, because we then may become very confused about what science is, what it can do, what it can't. It may become a mess. And I don't think that's fruitful. I think the step we have to make is to abandon this artificial, culturally imposed notion that only science is a valid method for acquiring knowledge. That is what is naive. That is what is silly, innocent, and counterproductive.
And dangerous.
Dangerous.
This comes up in our brilliant conversation with Ian McGilchrist. The episode is called Pushing Beyond Materialism. It's really dangerous, this scientism, because it's literally cutting out a whole part of our existence. But I wanted to just get your opinion on this idea of humility, because I think those timescales, when we're talking about millions of years of potential advancement of consciousness beyond our own, it really puts in perspective the limitations of our small sphere of knowledge and what science has been able to ascertain. And it really shows you almost definitely how much you don't know and how much there is still yet to understand and discover. Don't you think that humility has got to come back into the center of science?
Yes, but it's not something we can make happen by preaching it. 2,000 years of preaching Christianity didn't stop wars from happening. Humility is something that life either teaches you or doesn't. Eventually it does. It may teach you in the final 30 seconds of your life, but eventually life teaches you humility. And we have to wait for that. Now, why aren't we witnessing more humility around? There is a psychohistorical or psychosocial reason for this. Since God died in the late 19th century, as Nietzsche put it, God is dead, we've lost transcendent meaning in our lives. We are meaning-seeking animals. Our life has to be couched in meaning. And for almost the entire history of Western civilization, that meaning came from the idea of a transcendent aspect of nature that we couldn't understand, couldn't be acquainted directly with, but which nonetheless couched our lives in meaning and purpose, that we are part of something bigger than our ability to conceive. We lost that in the late 19th century. And when we lose one source of meaning, and this is psychology one-on-one, we fluid compensate towards another source of meaning. We always do that. And one alternative to transcendent meaning is closure. Even when we do not see a higher purpose in the death of our loved one, if we understand why it happened and we have a body to bury, we get closure. Things may be shit. I may hate the way things are, but at least I understand the way it works. That closure is a replacement for transcendent meaning. This is one-on-one psychology. It's not polemical, what I'm telling you. This is in the literature. Look for fluid compensation. That's the keyword. And closure is what we chose as the replacement for meaning since the late 19th century. That's why we spent 10 billion euros on the Large Hadron Collider, something that we have absolutely no practical applications for at least 30 years. Why do we do that? It's because we are absolutely desperate for closure. We hate our worldview. We hate this mechanistic universe that we believe is the case, that sort of drains all meaning out of life, makes everything be pointless, all the suffering pointless. We hate this. But at least if we understand it, we can get one up on it. You see,
but isn't that representative of the ego on the boat on this enormous ocean of the unknown? Surely it's a fool's game.
Of course, only children do this, but that's who we are. Our culture is adolescent. That's what children do. I mean, I'm not saying this is right. I'm saying it's natural. I'm saying there is a reason it's happening like this. We are desperate adolescents looking for meaning. especially the ones who think that they got a grip on it all, and they are the tough guys who face the hard facts in the face, the Daniel Dennetts. Those are the most deluded of all children, because they are so married to closure as an alternative to the meaning they lost, that they will grab on that boat even in face of a tsunami. They are afraid of go drifting away. They don't know what to hold on to. We are an adolescent culture. Come on, it's plainly obvious. We still go to war. Look at Europe in the 21st century. Do you need more proof that we are children? We are very, very desperate, lonely children without adult supervision. So we are married to closure because that's the only drifting piece of wood in the vast ocean that we have to grab onto. Otherwise, we sink and drown. So we will not give that up. Humility is far away down that road. Yes. Because the moment we have humility and we experience humility, that's the moment when you lose closure. And then you're in free fall, man. God help you. That's how we think.
So Bernardo, what is next? I mean, you've got this wonderful new book out, which I think is called Why Materialism is Baloney. Is that true?
Oh, that's a very old one.
That's one of the older ones. Which is the newest book? Because there is a book that's come out since the Jung's Metaphysics book.
Yes, that was 3 years ago. Science Ideated. No, it came out late. I finished writing it 3 years ago. Science Ideated is the name. And I'm trying to write 2 books this year. Let's see how it will go.
And I'm imagining that in there is going to be something about this second phase of life that you've been moved by.
In the second one of the 2 books, it will be almost all about that. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. I think it's something that we could all do with a little bit of insight into, certainly in Western culture. But there's so many points. Like you said, quite a few times in the interview there was like, oh, we need an hour to talk about this. We need an hour to talk about this. So I would absolutely adore to have you back on Chasing Consciousness in future, Bernardo, if that's going to be possible. But the thing is, I would really like to interview in about 1 million years where we could actually be slightly less adolescent as a culture and look back and sort of reflect on what's changed. Unfortunately, I'm afraid Kurzweil may be wrong, and we're not going to be able to do that. Bernardo,
I'm afraid he's wrong.
Bernardo Kastrup, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity, Freddie.